Thank you so much, President Nichols. I also very much enjoyed our meeting this morning. One of the things we talked about was convening a regional gathering of university centers with some of the presidents of the universities there, and having your level of leadership focused on this issue is a real treat. I told President Nichols, we have 67 university centers for excellence in developmental disabilities. This is my 62nd visit. And there's only been one other visit where I met with the president of the university, and that was at Minot State University in North Dakota. So you're in good company, and I think we could probably get the president of Minot State to come and be part of that meeting. And I also wanted to acknowledge Dr. Manago. I'm delighted that you see disability issues as an important part of the diversity work on campus. I had a chance last night to have dinner with some of the disability studies faculty, and it's been exciting for me to hear about the leadership on that. Just out of curiosity, how many people here are students at the university right now? Wow. So for the people that are remote, I think I just saw about 25 hands go up. And how many of you have taken classes in disability studies? So most of the hands that went up. So good job, disability studies faculty, getting your students to come. And how many here are faculty at the university in some capacity? So again, great turnout. I really appreciate people showing up today. So I wanted to acknowledge Sandy Root-Elledge and Keith Miller. We're lucky to have the founding director of WIND and the person who came up with the WIND name, which he shared with me. He thought of as he was driving across the prairie. So I had an opportunity to sample the High Plains beer at, what's it called, altitude. So I liked it, and your assistive technology project is called Water. So we've got to come up with, I'm thinking ECHO can be the first initial of an Earth acronym. We have to figure out what the rest of it is. But, you know, in all seriousness, just to throw in a little bit of my background, I was asked to come and talk about kind of grassroots advocacy and the importance of it here in Wyoming and nationally. And I just wanted to share a little bit more of my background. I self-identified as a second-generation disability advocate because I graduated from law school in 1990, the year that the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted into law. So I'm part of a generation of professionals who have benefited from the work that came before us to create a federal civil rights law. Senator Harkin, who was my first boss in Washington in 1993, was one of the lead Democrats on that bill. He had a brother, Frank Harkin, who was deaf, and he was in the House for 10 years and did work in the House supporting access to communications for the deaf and hard of hearing community, and then realized that the broader disability community needed a champion. And so while he was in the House, he worked on a wide range of disability issues, brought that with him to the Senate, joined Senator Kennedy's committee. Senator Kennedy was very committed on disability as well. And Senator Kennedy, when he was a freshman, made him the chair of the Disability Policy Subcommittee, which did the work on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I kind of came into this movement after the pioneers had had a huge achievement. I have bipolar disorder, and I had my first serious episode of depression during my last semester of law school. And luckily I've been able to be out with my disability throughout my career, and it hasn't held me back. I think it helps that I've had good academic credentials. It helps that I've worked in the disability field, and it helps that I've had phenomenal mentors and bosses that have encouraged me to be open about my disability. I also, I think one of the things that is unique about disability as you compare it with some other areas of diversity is oftentimes you're the only person with a disability in your family. So I feel like one of the things that we have an opportunity to do in the disability field is educate our family members about disabilities. And I think it's particularly important to educate children and grandchildren as they're growing up to kind of understand that disability is a natural part of the human experience, that you shouldn't be afraid to ask questions, and that it's good to kind of get to know people with disabilities. So when my oldest son was in preschool, my wife and I were invited separately to come and talk to the class about what we did for a living. It was called Community Helpers, and the idea was, what do you do and how does it help the community? So my wife is an American history professor, And she came to the class of 3-year-olds and brought age-appropriate historical artifacts. And the preschool teachers were amazed that a college professor could make history interesting for 3-year-olds. So the pressure was on when it was my turn to come and talk. And at the time I was working at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for a commissioner who had a disability who had been appointed by President Clinton. My boss's name was Paul Miller. And I wanted to get across to the 3-year-olds that I was a lawyer, that I worked for the federal government, that I did civil rights work, and that I was promoting fairness in the workplace, and I was especially interested in fairness for workers with disabilities. And I kind of intuited that in all of that. I'm a Virgo, and I think trying to get in all those details with a 3-year-old was not a good idea, but it's hard for my Virgo mind to skip over details. But I kind of intuited with the 3-year-olds that the hardest thing for them was going to be this concept of disability. So I was practicing with my son. His name's Anthony Garrett, but we called him AG at the time. And I said, AG, do you know what a disability is? And he said, yeah. And I said, what is it? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, you know, like somebody who uses a wheelchair. Who do you know who uses a wheelchair? And he said, Chris Griffin. And he knew Chris because she worked with me at the commission. And when he would come to work with me, she would have presents for him or candy. So she was kind of high on the radar screen. And then I said, or somebody who used a white cane, who do you know who uses a white cane? And he said, Chris Kaczynski. Chris also worked at the commission. He commuted with me from Baltimore. And sometimes we would give him a ride home from the train station. So AJ got to know him. And then I said, sometimes somebody has a disability, but you don't know from looking at them that they have a disability. And some people call that a hidden disability. And I said, AJ, can you give me an example of a hidden disability? And he said, like being a lawyer? Sometimes the true stories are better information than you make up. I mean, it was true that at that moment in his life, the people that he knew that had disabilities, a lot of them were also lawyers. So they made the connection. Some people would see that as a sign of progress, some might not. But I really do think, you know, if you think about the mission of the university, one of the opportunities for the University of Wyoming and for all of our universities in our network is to have the people who are touched by this university come away with a deeper appreciation of what inclusion looks like for students with disabilities. A number of universities have started inclusive higher education programs specifically for students with intellectual disabilities, where they have, like in many cases, the 2-year certificate program where students come, they do internships, they have the college experience, they have the peer interaction, they do, you know, the classroom work, and then they move on to employment, and it's become kind of a bridge to employment with a higher education component. But one of the things I love about that program in some campuses is how many other students are touched by the program. So like at Vanderbilt, every student with an intellectual disability has 6 students that are supporting them in some way. Some of them are paid, some of them aren't, over the course of their 2 years. And many of them say that that was the most meaningful part of their college experience at Vanderbilt. So I think it's worth thinking about. You've got the disability studies program, you've got WIND. What else can you do to expose all the people that come through this great university to a way of thinking about disability where it is a natural part of the human experience, it's part of human diversity, it's not an inherently negative thing, and the negative outcomes that people with disabilities often encounter are based not on what's intrinsic to their disability, but in the failings of our education system, our transportation system, our healthcare system, our employment system to create real opportunities for them to do what they're capable of doing. I wanted to share one other story before I get into the meat of the presentation. I mentioned that I've been out with my disability throughout my career, and it hasn't always been positive, the reactions I get. And I wanted to share one thing that happened to me early in my career, because I think it illustrates a phenomenon of how disability discrimination often plays out. I applied to be a staff attorney at a national organization in DC that did advocacy for the civil rights of people with mental disabilities, and they had a focus on mental illness. So I thought it would be helpful in my cover letter to mention that I was a mental health consumer, because it would give me a source of credibility for the work that they were doing, a connection to their mission. And the lawyer that was screening the resumes was concerned. It was like a red flag for him. So he talked to one of my references who ran a fellowship program that I participated in after law school and said, you know, Andy says he's a mental health consumer. Can you tell me anything about it? And my reference said, well, you should really talk to Andy about it, but as far as I can tell, you know, he's managing it well and it wouldn't be an issue at work. So I ended up being in Washington interviewing for other jobs, ultimately getting a job with Senator Harkin. But I said, I'm going to be in Washington, would you guys like to interview me while I'm in town? So they said, sure, come on in. There was 2 lawyers that did the interview, both nationally recognized lawyers that advocated for people with mental illness. And we went through the whole interview and they never asked about my mental health. So at the end of the interview, I said, they said to me, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? And I said, well, I know one of you talked to one of my references about me being a mental health consumer, and I wanted to take this opportunity to answer any questions that you might have. And the lawyer that had talked to my reference realized that he had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a clear violation of the ADA. It's a pre-employment disability-related inquiry. And by the way, when I worked at the EEOC, I got to write an example into their guidance that was this example. And so he kind of looked like, you know, kind of scared. And the other lawyer was also a little wary. And she said, well, Andy, is there anything you'd like to tell us? Which was smart. There was nothing wrong with that question. So I, you know, talked a little bit about my experience and tried to connect it to their mission. And the lawyer said, and this is a direct quote, she said, oh, come on, Andy, we all see a therapist. Why is that relevant? And in her mind, you know, I was a neurotic lawyer and I wasn't a real disabled person. And they represented real disabled people, real people with psychiatric disabilities who were homeless, you know, who had lots of bad outcomes. She couldn't wrap her head around the idea that you could have a psychiatric disability, graduate from Stanford Law School, and be a very well-qualified candidate to be a staff attorney. So I took that as a challenge that, you know, my disability wasn't real or serious enough. So I kind of went into some of the details of my condition that I wouldn't normally talk about in a job interview. And then it was like a light bulb went off and she got that I really was bipolar. And she talked about a staff member that they had who was bipolar, who was inappropriate at staff meetings. And she was worried about whether I was going to be inappropriate at staff meetings. Well, needless to say, I didn't get the job. But I did send a letter to the executive director of the organization saying, you know, you may want to think about, you know, how your senior staff are interacting with candidates with disabilities. And I know he followed up with the lawyers. But I tell that story because I think it's a real phenomenon in the disability field. It affects people with non-visible disabilities, but it also affects people with visible disabilities. The idea that it's not significant enough to matter. So basically suck it up or get over it. Don't try to use it to get an unfair advantage that you don't really need. Or if you get over that hurdle that yes, it is significant, then you quickly move into, then you're not qualified for the position that you're applying for. And we really ran into that with the Supreme Court. We had a number of cases in the Supreme Court where they were afraid to have a broad definition of disability for purposes of the ADA. So they narrowed the scope of the protected class, and the evidence that people presented on whether they were disabled enough to have civil rights protections was used against them on whether they could bring a case under the ADA. And then if they got over that hurdle, the evidence they presented to show that they were substantially limited in their major life activity was used against them on the issue of whether they were qualified for the job. So the Supreme Court created a catch-22, and in 2008, Senator Harkin, Senator Kennedy, Senator Hatch, a number of the elected officials who had worked on the original ADA came together to pass the ADA Amendments Act, which overturned 4 Supreme Court decisions that had narrowed the scope of the protected class. And it was a completely bipartisan vote, just like the original ADA vote. And that's one of the nice things about working in disability. There's a lot of bipartisan support, including your 2 senators, who I'll talk more about. But both Senator Enzi and Senator Barrasso have distinguished themselves in the Senate as champions for people with disabilities. President Nichols did a nice job describing our network. And I just wanted to share that when this network was created, the real driving force behind it was not President Kennedy. He did sign the legislation, but it was his sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. And Eunice had a vision. It was kind of, this was the Kennedy years, the best and the brightest years. Her vision was, if we can get smart people at universities across the country to focus on children with intellectual disabilities, we can use the power of science and research and evaluation to improve the lifespan and the quality of life of children with intellectual disabilities and adults with intellectual disabilities. And that's really what our network's founding charge was. We were originally called University Affiliated Facilities, and people were doing research in facilities. Then we became University Affiliated Programs and ultimately University Centers for Excellence. But if you add the budgets of all of our centers together, now today it's a $650 million network. And you can think of it as a $650 million research and development arm for the disability field. And as I learned about the work that's happening here at WIN is leading in a number of areas that this whole network could benefit from. And that's, to me, the beauty of our network. We can take something that's working in Laramie or Cody or anywhere in Wyoming and apply it in another rural setting or in an urban setting. We can evaluate it, and then we can scale it up if we have good evidence that it's working. And I just think the network is the best kept secret in the disability world. We don't have a brand like Special Olympics. We don't have a brand like Easter Seals or Goodwill. But in many ways, we've had a bigger impact on the quality of life of children and adults with disabilities over a 50-year period than a lot of other organizations that have much larger brands. So the other thing that I'll just say, and I really want to mention this to President Nichols, is a lot of us are feeling, including Senator Harkin, are feeling like the disability community is at a tipping point. Major institutions are paying more attention to people with disabilities than they have historically. Microsoft just hired a bunch of people with disabilities to innovate around accessible technology. They have a deaf woman who's leading the effort, who has a child on the autism spectrum, who's phenomenal. And she's hired all these talented people with disabilities, and Microsoft has positioned themselves as a global leader on this issue. And they're doing amazing work all over the world, trying to build technology that includes people with disabilities and hire people with disabilities to work at Microsoft. The World Bank, the president of the World Bank just spoke at a summit that Senator Harkin hosted in Washington, where he said, we're not going to achieve our mission of eliminating poverty globally unless we get serious about bringing people with disabilities into the labor force globally. The president of the Ford Foundation spoke at the same event. Ford has been working at reducing inequality for decades. They have never had a strong disability component to what they're doing. The current president did a mea culpa 2 years ago, an open letter saying it's ridiculous that we say we're about eliminating inequality and we've completely ignored disability, and our own headquarters was not accessible for people with disabilities, and we're trying to be a bastion for equality globally. So he has spent a lot of money and really done a phenomenal job of integrating disability into everything that they're doing forward. So to me, all of these things are signs. Even the New York Times, the New York Times used to ignore disability. Now they have a weekly column on disability in the Sunday Review, where they have different writers from around the disability community, including disability studies professors. Rosemary Garland Thompson at Emory had the first one, and she's like a guru in disability studies. So I really do feel like the leadership of our country in lots of different areas and globally are paying more attention to disability issues. I think it's an exciting time to be working in the field. So, I was asked to talk about grassroots, and I'll say, the way that disability policy happens is by people with disabilities and family members going to policymakers and telling them what's working and what's not working, and asking for common sense, practical solutions that will produce better outcomes. It appeals across a broad ideological spectrum. Our goal is for people with disabilities to be in the economic mainstream. If we are in the economic mainstream, we are taxpayers, and that's good for the economy. So you can present this message as a civil rights, social justice message. You can paint it as an economic development message, but we do have a case to make across an ideological spectrum. And it also helps to have allies who don't have a disability or a personal connection, but say, yes, this is important. And as a leader, I'm going to promote the civil and human rights of people with disabilities. The leadership happens at all levels of government, local government, state government, federal government. And you know, as we think about the next 5 years, you know, Sandy mentioned the 5-year plan for wind. There are a number of policy issues that are going to rise to the surface in Wyoming and at the federal level, and many of these will play out at the local level as well. And I just want to touch on a few of them because I think they're all things that wind is well positioned to play a leadership role on, and the state of Wyoming is well positioned to play a leadership role on. The first one is the one that Senator Harkin was very focused on, especially during the last 4 years of his 30 years in the Senate, which is labor force participation rate. Right now, Wyoming has one of the highest labor force participation rates in the country for people with disabilities. We have data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics where they collect the data. Disability employment data is never perfect because it's hard to identify the denominator. People like me don't always show up as having disabilities, you know, because the way they ask the question, they used to ask the question, do you have a disability that limits the type or amount of work that you can do? I would not answer that question yes. If they just asked me if I had a disability, I would answer that question yes. So how you ask the question matters. And you know, the data folks know that if you want it to be meaningful, you've got to ask the question in a way where a big population of folks answering it will answer it with some consistency. So we've come up with 6 questions that are asked on the census, that are asked in a number of the federally funded data sets. And based on how people answer that question, Wyoming shows up, I think, as like in the top 4 states of labor force participation rates. Most of the other states that show up as high states are states with low population density. So it may be that one of the reasons why there are more people with disabilities in the labor force is there aren't a lot of other people. so you know, if you're hiring somebody to be a dishwasher at a restaurant, you know, you may not have a lot of alternatives to the person with a disability. And I do think in the community, a lot of rural communities tend to have strong work ethics, and they want everybody to do their part. And I think sometimes that gets extended to folks with disabilities in rural communities in ways that it may not get extended where there's more population density and where there are more people going after jobs. But I know Sandy has other theories about whether that you know, labor force number is real. But if you think about employment, we've got a number of bipartisan initiatives that Wyoming is well positioned to play a leadership role on. One is the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which is the federal law that sets the standards for vocational rehabilitation and workforce development programs. There was a requirement in the last reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act that every VR program in the country would spend at least 15% of their VR allocation serving transition age young people with disability. This is a new requirement. I met a VR person from Cody. Is she here? Yeah, there she is in the back, who is working on implementing that in Cody. It's very exciting for me to hear about how this is happening on the ground, because I think historically some VR agencies were already doing this, and it sounds like Wyoming has been doing this in some form for a long time. But some VR agencies were waiting for kids to graduate from high school before they would serve them. And the evidence that we have says that the best predictor of whether somebody with a childhood onset disability is going to have success in the labor force after they leave school is if they have a paying job while they're in school. So if VR is not working with young people and working with the state education agency, the Office of Special Education Programs, and other players in the lives of that kid while the kid is still in school, then it's a missed opportunity for us to have better outcomes. So I think Wyoming is and can be a leader on implementation of that law and really trying to get better outcomes for this generation of young people who are coming through the school system. The other thing that a number of states have done, which Wyoming has done, is they've issued governor-led proclamations around something called employment first. And the idea of employment first is that if we're going to be supporting adults with significant disabilities from the moment they enter adulthood, we should have an expectation that the best way we can support adults with disabilities, including adults with very significant disabilities, is for them to have a job. And instead of trying a bunch of other things, let's try employment first. Let's try to get them into a job, ideally a competitive integrated job at a fair wage. Let them have an experience of what that feels like. And the expectation is that people are going to want to stay in a labor force role. So Wyoming is one of, I think there's probably 40 states now that have an employment first initiative going on. It's very bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats have bought into it. And I feel like that could be the beginning of a broader conversation of how can we take the biggest programs that support people with disabilities. Medicaid would be at the top of the list, but also Social Security, disability, and supplemental security income, and Medicare. Those four programs are the biggest programs from a dollar standpoint that support people with disabilities. How can we take them and spend that money in a way where we make investments that produce a long-term return on investment? For people with lifelong disabilities, making the investments at the early stage of their careers will often have a good long-term benefit. Education is another area where Wyoming can be a leader. I think this is where the ECHO model that you guys are using to create communities of practice to help teachers use evidence-based practices in the classroom. They're going to help students learn, help them have access to the general curriculum, and help them get ready for the jobs that are going to exist after they graduate. It's a great model. And I don't know any state that is using, tell me if I'm wrong, using ECHO in the educational setting the way that you are. So you are the national leader on that issue. Healthcare is another important piece of the puzzle. Right now in Washington, there's a vote that's pending, and maybe I haven't been looking at the newspaper, so I don't think it's happened yet, but there's a vote that's pending on the tax bill. You guys have probably read about it. A lot of people are concerned that if this bill becomes law, the one that is currently being considered by the Senate, it's going to take a lot of money out of the federal coffers, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on other programs. So Medicaid is one of those programs. There's a repeal of the requirement in the Affordable Care Act that people purchase health insurance. People are concerned what that's going to do to the marketplace for people that are buying insurance on exchanges. There's a concern about the impact it's going to have on vocational rehabilitation budgets, because vocational rehabilitation is not an entitlement. So those budgets are discretionary, and they can come down at the federal level. They can also come down at the state level. So there's a real concern on what it's going to do to state budgets. The federal government can have a deficit. Most states have a constitutional provision in their state constitution that say they can't have a deficit. So most states have to balance their budgets. The feds don't. So you remove a lot of federal dollars, the states are left holding the bag, and the states have to figure out a way to pay for that. So I think when we think about healthcare in the context of this tax bill, which looks like it's going to pass, we're going to have to get creative in terms of how do we keep the supports in place for people with disabilities and keep access to healthcare so people can have success in the labor market and so they can live with dignity in the community. I think this is going to be a real challenge for Wyoming and for other states moving forward. Transportation is another issue. When you talk to people with disabilities that live in rural areas and you ask them what is the #1 barrier to employment, if they have a disability that affects their ability to drive, they will tell you transportation is the #1 barrier to employment. And really, Wyoming, I think, could be an innovator in trying to figure out transportation solutions, particularly for young people with disabilities who are trying to get to work. And one way that Wyoming could innovate is try to hire people with disabilities, including people who are aging into disabilities, who can still drive, to provide transportation for other folks who need the transportation to get to work. So that's a twofer. You're creating a job for a person with a disability, helping another person get to work. The sharing economy is bringing a lot of people into the labor force as professional drivers. There's no reason that can't work in a rural level, and the internet access may not work, but pulling people in and to be part of a kind of, not a full-time job, but part of a transportation provider infrastructure is the kind of creative solution that can work in a lot of rural communities. I had a chance to have breakfast yesterday morning with folks in your communications department, including like speech language pathology, talking about access to technology that can help people communicate. I think one of the biggest bad outcomes in the United States is we have a lot of children who graduate from high school without the ability to communicate. So they've been in school in many cases for 22 years, and the school never figured out the right combination of high-tech, low-tech solutions, human solutions that can help the person communicate independently. And if you can't communicate independently, you're more at risk of abuse and neglect. It's harder to get a job in the labor market, and it's harder to have self-determination. If you can't communicate, it's hard to tell somebody what you want to eat, where you want to live, what time you want to get up. You know, all of those things, it helps if you can communicate to yourself. Many people communicate non-verbally, and it's wrong to think that that's not communication. But being able to interpret it and interpret it with some precision is important. And that's something that we can do while kids are still in school if we surround them with the right supports. So again, Wyoming can be a leader in that, and the ECHO model is one way to build a community of practice around that in a state like Wyoming. And then lastly, and this is kind of my favorite topic, Wyoming can be a leader as an innovator in disability benefits, in the big entitlement programs. We're living in a culture in Washington where the federal government and the executive branch and the legislative branch is saying, we don't want a big know-it-all federal government telling states what to do. States are closer to the population that they're serving. Let's let the states have discretion in how they support people with disabilities, support children, support vulnerable populations, whatever the issue is. So I think that creates an opportunity for a governor to say to the feds, if I take all the money that we're spending on Medicaid to support people with disabilities in Wyoming, and all the money that we're spending in Social Security, disability insurance, and supplemental security income, and Medicare, and you give me the discretion to spend that money in a way that makes more sense in terms of producing good long-term outcomes, can I come up with a better way to spend that money? And if you look at it at the federal level, we're spending $500 billion a year on those 4 programs. And if you compare that to vocational rehabilitation, we're spending $4 billion on VR. So VR is a program that's designed to invest in people and help them build their human capital and get into the labor force. These other programs require people to prove that they can't work in order to get the supports in the first place. And that is just backwards, anachronistic policy. The definition of disability in the Social Security Act was written in 1956. So in 1956, we decided the best way to determine if somebody with Down syndrome has a significant disability is to get a letter from their doctor telling me that this person with Down syndrome, because of their Down syndrome, is not going to be able to engage in substantial gainful activity. Doctors are not in a good position to make that determination. They don't know what a person with Down syndrome can do. It depends on what kind of supports are around them and what kind of jobs are available for them. So there's a real opportunity for us to come up with a better way to determine eligibility for disability benefits and then provide supports, going back to the employment first model, provide supports with an expectation that everybody will benefit from participating in the labor force to some degree. They may not all be able to work full time, but that doesn't mean they can't participate. And at the beginning of their career, it's hard to know what they can do until they're out there doing it. So we should be doing everything in our power to support people to try to do something that maybe even their own parents didn't know was possible. So if you're thinking about, well, is there a model out there that we can look at? I would say look at Australia. Australia has something called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. They use the word scheme not in a negative context. But they had a bunch of parents and adults with disabilities came together in Australia and said, our current system of supporting people with significant disabilities is broken. And because it's broken, it's destroying our lives. Lots of families were having their lives destroyed by making up for the failings of the public system. And they did, the government commissioned a high-profile bipartisan study of lost productivity. So because of the failings of the system, what's the impact on the economy and lost productivity of parents who are not working and siblings who are not working because they're taking care of their family member with disability. So they projected that, and then they projected it moving forward as the population was aging, and they said this is not sustainable. So they came up with a disability insurance model where everybody pays into the system from the moment they start working, and that money is used to support people with disabilities from birth. So the interventions start at birth for people that are born with disabilities. And the fascinating, I just had an opportunity to spend a day with folks that are working on this in Australia. They've been doing it now for about 10 years. But the fascinating statistic that stuck with me was they're now supporting a third more people in Australia. So they're reaching a lot more people with this new system, and they're spending twice as much money. So by this disability insurance system, a lot more money is coming into the system, and they're using the money to provide more robust supports for more people, and they're getting dramatically better outcomes. So I think that's something that we can study. What's interesting to me about Australia is the conservatives in Australia completely support this new system, and the liberals completely support the new system. So that to me is a model that's worth looking at. It's taking a lifespan approach. They look at, for people that have adult onset disabilities, what happens right after the onset of the disability? What can we do to keep them on a trajectory where they're going to stay connected to the labor force, and they're getting much better outcomes. So I say all this to say that Wyoming can be an innovator on basically reinventing disability benefits, and then we can use that to change the programs at the federal level. Welfare reform happened the same way. The state of Wisconsin under Tommy Thompson innovated, and then the feds used that as a model to do welfare reform. The president has said the next thing that he wants to work on after the tax bill is welfare reform. So that's scary for a lot of folks because they think, well, typically when Republicans say they want to work on welfare reform, their focus is fraud. They're concerned that there are people on benefits that don't deserve to be on there. But I think we could have a much more interesting bipartisan conversation if we start with the question, are these programs the right programs in the 21st century that are supporting people with disabilities for the goals that are consistent with the Americans with Disabilities Act? And if we start the conversation there, I feel like you can start to build bipartisan support for reforms that are real, meaningful reforms similar to what they're doing in Australia. So if you think about the next 5 years for Wyoming, I think one of the opportunities for wind, I know there are people here from the Developmental Disabilities Council, there are people here from the Protection and Advocacy Agency, there are people here from Developmental Disability Service Providers, the university writ large, is what can you do to help grassroots leaders in Wyoming be effective change agents with their elected and appointed officials? And my first advice on that is start young. One of the things that I think is a movement across the country that's kind of losing some steam and some funding over time is the youth leadership forums. Many states, it started with California, which had a very big one, but many states have been doing forums during the summer where they bring together young people with a wide range of disabilities for a week. And they learn about the history of the disability rights movement. They learn about a civil rights, social justice frame for disability. They learn about being proud and comfortable in your identity as a person with a disability. And for many of them, it's the first time they've been around a critical mass of other people with disabilities their age. So I know it's hard to do in a state as spread out as Wyoming, but I think if you could get a robust youth leadership forum thing going in Wyoming, it's a way for you to find people while they're young, give them kind of a sense that they're part of something much bigger than themselves. Hopefully a lot of them will come to the University of Wyoming for college, and they can stay organized and connected to each other during college, and they'll go to college all over the country. But I do think kind of some kind of a leadership program for high school students, and I think even starting with middle school students sometimes is a good idea. You could do that at the local level, and then they could graduate to a statewide program in high school. But I feel like that's going to be an important part of helping people build a sense of advocacy as part of leadership and a sense of comfort that, yes, I have a disability, and no, it's not a negative thing. It's a positive part of my identity. And that's hard for a lot of young people to hear because they don't hear it from a lot of other people. You know, it's not a message that a lot of young people get exposed to. Another opportunity in Wyoming is something called Partners in Policymaking. This is something that the Developmental Disabilities Council in Minnesota started, but there are programs going all over the country. It's a year-long program where parents and self-advocates and sometimes siblings come together and learn how to be effective policy advocates. And they come together on weekends. Many of them have full-time jobs, and they do the schedule in a way that works for people to do it when they're not at work. And if you look at the partners graduates around the country, many of them are the movers and shakers in the disability field. So I feel like for Wyoming, there's an opportunity to restart that, and you call it something else if you want to try to get some of that going. Again, you could use the ECHO model to do that, especially when people aren't coming together in person. You've got the LEND program here in Wyoming. LEND stands for Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities. It's an interdisciplinary training program where people are learning how to work with children and families where the children have developmental disabilities, and they're learning how to lead interdisciplinary teams and impact policy at a systems level. So it's a great program. You guys are part of a regional LEND with Utah. There are family leaders, and I know there are family LEND trainees here in the audience. There's family faculty, and there are self-advocate LEND trainees and self-advocate faculty. So that's another opportunity for Wyoming to grow that and build it. And then I'm a big believer in internships and fellowships with elected officials. When I was at the American Association of People with Disabilities, we started a summer program that's still going on, where college students with disabilities from around the country come to Washington to work for their senator, their member of the House. AUCB paid to bring them to Washington, paid for their housing. They all lived together during the summer, so they built a sense of cross-disability solidarity and identity over the course of the summer. And they had a huge impact on the congressional offices where they were placed. One of our interns was a blind woman named Stacy Savenka, who worked for Senator Brownback from Kansas. He hired her when she finished college, promoted her 3 times, and when his wife would bring high-profile guests from Kansas to take a tour of the Capitol, she always asked Stacy, the blind staffer for Senator Brownback, to give her the tour of the Capitol because she had memorized everything and she gave the best tours of anything in the Brownback office. Things like that where people can go in there, get to know the policy maker from the inside, see what it's like to meet with a constituent where you're on the receiving end. It's a great opportunity for people to kind of get the bug to want to do that kind of advocacy and stay connected over the course of their careers, even if they don't do it as a full-time job. I think for Wyoming, I know that some of the state doesn't have great access to the internet, but I do think that it's important if you're going to do advocacy in the 21st century to link to other people that have similar interests locally, at the state level, and nationally over social media. Social media is the way people come together in the 21st century. I know that a lot of folks just decided that they don't like it. But I remember talking to my group of scientists, because my scientists are the most, these are like my NIH-funded white lab co-scientists. They're the most anti-social media of anybody I've ever. And I remember saying to them, how many of you go on Facebook or Twitter once a week? And maybe one of them shoots their hand. And I said, do you remember when we started having personal computers and you decided you didn't need to learn how to use a personal computer? Well, you're going to feel the same way about social media at some point in your career. So if you're going to do advocacy in this space and you're not on Facebook and you're not on Twitter, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to get up to speed and to connect with other people who care about the same thing that you care about. So I have a commitment from Sandy that Wayne is going to get a Twitter account. Am I right about that? But I really think social media needs to be part of the strategy here in Wyoming. And the last thing I want to say, just in terms of advice for the next 5 years, is, and I appreciate the commitments around diversity, have targeted strategies for Native Americans in Wyoming, targeted strategies for refugees and other underrepresented groups. If you just go to the usual suspects, you will miss these groups. And these groups desperately need leadership that can change the world for children and adults with disabilities in their community. There are children with disabilities in all these communities. If you're in a low-income environment, the disability incidence goes up. It goes up because of access to healthcare, access to screening. It goes up because of nutrition. Lots of reasons it goes up. But many times our leadership efforts and our elite advocacy efforts leave out these populations. So I really encourage you, and I know you've done this, to really think about what's the strategy to get a pipeline of land trainees from the local Native American community. Our center in Nevada did that. They built a relationship with the tribe in northern Nevada. And every year, one of their land trainees is from that tribe. And over time, all the alumni go back, and you get a critical mass of folks who've been exposed to these issues. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to open up for questions, is kind of what I've learned in 25 years in Washington of effective policy advocacy. And this will be quick, and these are just kind of my tips. First, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So if you take what's happening right now with the tax bill, some people feel like the sky is falling, and if this tax bill passes, every Republican who voted for it is now equal, and we can never work with them on anything else. And if that's your view, you will have no impact on policy. So you have to recognize that there are going to be times where Democrats and Republicans disappoint you, and you need to maintain the relationship. And you can't get so caught up in the moment that you destroy the relationship because you're so angry about the way they voted on a particular issue. Focus on building relationships and maintaining them even when it's hard. Use policy advocacy to build relationships and build power. So when I was at AAPD, when we were a small organization and we thought about what issues we were going to take on, our goal, whatever issue we worked on, was to be stronger at the end than we were at the beginning. The goal was not necessarily to win. If we won, that was great. But if we won in a way that made us weaker because we destroyed a really important relationship to get that victory, that ultimately was not good for us. So we were always trying to think about, can we come out of this with more relationships, with more of a profile, with more capacity and strength for the next issue, more people on our distribution list. You know, back then we were thinking about email distribution lists, not as much about social media, but obviously social media platforms. Advocacy issues are a way to build your platform, and the platform is important. Winning the issue will come with time, but if you're not growing and building your platform, then you're missing the opportunity to take the long view. And here's the most important tip I can give you on policy advocacy. I wish I knew who said this. Your ability to influence another person depends on how they feel about themselves when they're with you. So I'll say it again, your ability to influence another person depends on how they feel about themselves when they're with you. So one of the biggest mistakes advocates make is they get emotionally caught up in the issue and they lecture the elected official or the staff person, and they don't treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve. And then that person's not feeling good about themselves, so they're shutting down, they're not listening to you. So a lot of times people go right into their talking points and they don't take the time to say, how's your wife? You know, how's your husband? How's your kid? You know, interesting weather we're having, you know, whatever. But to build some kind of human connection before you then try to bring them along on whatever the policy issue is. So that is just critically important. You could think of that as good manners. But by the way, it also works with your spouse and with your parents and with your children. If they feel good about themselves when they're with you, they're more likely to listen to you. And then I think when you think about you as an individual, and this is true if you have a disability, if you have a family member, or you just care about the issue, try to position yourself as a resource for other people, as a cheerleader. I learned yesterday from one of the ECHO programs that if you're doing behavior management, it's good to say 5 good things for every 1 bad. Well, again, that's a good thing in life. You know, if you're going to give somebody constructive criticism, try to come up with a lot of other things you can say that can help them receive the constructive criticism, recognizing, you know, understand that you see the good in them, and that's why you're giving them the constructive criticism. And position yourself as a worker bee. If somebody has to draft a letter, volunteer to draft it. This worked very well for me during the Clinton administration. I was with a group of Clinton appointees with disabilities that were trying to do big things. I always was the one that had to draft whatever they wanted to do. And it was a great way for me to show them my skills and to have a different kind of relationship. They saw me as a substantive person that could help them accomplish their goals and allow them to give keynote speeches and do what they needed to do while somebody in the back office actually wrote stuff. That kind of worker bee role is a way to have an impact on policy because everybody likes people that actually do the work as opposed to the people that take the credit for the work. There's usually a lot of people in that category. And then I think it's important to have humility when you do this kind of work and to have a sense of humor. The stuff that we're talking about is heavy stuff. It's life and death stuff. You know, we're working on the healthcare bill. You know, one of the talking points was people are going to die if we take $800 billion out of the Medicaid program. But if all we do is the doom and gloom scenarios and we can't kind of laugh and we can't smile and we can't have a sense of humor in the work we're doing, we're not going to be as effective as policy advocates. We're going to be like the grim reaper. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is true in Wyoming, but it's true in California too, is cultivate Republicans. Everything that we want to do will be easier if Republicans are supported. Doesn't matter who's in the majority, doesn't matter if you're in a red state or a blue state or a purple state, cultivate Republicans. And I know for some people they get very frustrated when Republicans vote on a particular issue or a particular senator or a particular president or whatever, but the Republican Party is a big party. There are good people all over the Republican Party, and there are jerks all over the Democratic Party. So if we don't cultivate Republicans, we're not going to be effective. Obviously, we also need to cultivate Democrats, but I feel like that comes more naturally for a lot of us. And we need to learn how to cultivate Republicans. So I'm going to close with a quote from Martin Luther King, and I think it's particularly apt for this moment in American history. He said that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Even a superficial look at history reveals that no social advance rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. Dr. King said, without persistent effort, time itself becomes an ally of the insurgent and primitive forces of traditional emotionalism and social destruction. And he said, this is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. So friends, you here in the room are the dedicated individuals that Dr. King was talking about. Children and adults with disabilities in Wyoming and their families are counting on folks in this room to do the vigorous and positive action that Dr. King was talking about. And it's my honor to be here with you today. Thank you. So I think we have time for Q&A. I think we've got roving mics, so if you raise your hand, we can either bring you a mic, or I'm happy to just repeat the question into the microphone before the comment. So I know the first one is always hard, but who's brave? Happy to take questions or comments. Yes, the special education professor in the middle.
Yes. One area that you didn't mention and that Wind is showing some leadership is that of voting. And we've done research in this state, and a significantly less number of people with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual disability, actually do have to go out and vote. So I think this is a real crucial issue that has been long ignored, and it's actually been suggested as the last remaining area of discrimination that we really haven't grappled with. So I'm curious about your reaction.
No, I think it's a point well taken. When I was at APD, I had a person who worked for me named Jim Dixon. I don't know if you've met Jim. He's a blind person who's been focused on voting his whole career. Jim used to introduce himself to people saying he had 2 disabilities. He was blind and he was blunt. But Jim would have loved your question and would be literally cheering right now that you asked that question. You're absolutely right. If we don't, but I wouldn't think of it just in terms of people with intellectual disability. If we don't organize voters who have a strong disability interest when they're at the polls, so that includes VR counselors, it includes special education teachers, it includes parents and siblings, it includes people with a wide range of disabilities, including people with mental disabilities who sometimes get a message that they're not allowed to vote. But if we're not kind of organizing those folks and having them, you know, doing kind of list enhancement where we figure out who are the folks that vote in primaries and we cultivate them because the primaries are more important than the general election and we're not turning them out to vote, then we're not going to have as much impact politically. And in a state that doesn't have a big population, a little bit of organizing can have a big impact because there aren't as many people voting. So you're absolutely right. And I think in the intellectual disability context, there's a guardianship piece here too. Because a lot of people think if you have an intellectual disability and you have a guardian, then you're not allowed to vote because somehow you've given that up. And the reality is unless the guardian has a plenary guardianship where there's been an adjudication that you're not able to vote, you have every right to vote as a person with intellectual disability, even if you have a guardian. So it's important to educate families, especially families that have kids that are becoming adults. Don't get the kind of guardianship that's going to limit their rights to vote like every other citizen. If a citizen without a disability can vote for a ridiculous reason, then a person with a disability should be able to vote for their own ridiculous reason. So you're absolutely right that should be part of the strategy. Yeah.
Yes, some of the people from Windsor. Oh, great, thank you.
This is the better half of Sandy. Or the other half.
I wouldn't know about that. I just wanted to thank you, mostly for what you said, but also for telling us to be patient, not to be angry, and to look at both sides of the situation, because for kids with disabilities, this goes myself, when something happens like the tax bill, you get very angry. I know I do.
Yeah.
But to look at it, to think it through, and to look at both sides, Republican and Democrat. And I appreciate you bringing that up because it sort of eased my mind a bit. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is a survival mechanism for me. I've been in Washington for so long. I do get emotional, not only am I bipolar, but I'm also Italian heritage. So I've got a lot of capacity to get upset with people, but I've found that usually is not strategic. You know, and I try, when I go into a meeting with an elected official, I always remind myself as I go into the meeting, what's the outcome that I want from this meeting? And then what can I do during this meeting that would maximize the chance that I'm going to get that outcome? And losing my temper is generally not going to help me get the outcome. So I do think and it's part of it's like a self-care thing. We have to recognize that we're in it for the long run. The pendulum swings back, and we need to be ready when the pendulum swings back with an agenda that can repair whatever harm was just done and move the ball forward. We had an ABCD meeting right after the election, so in December of last year. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in the doom and gloom that we don't really think about the limits of the White House and the limits of the federal government. But the reality is at the beginning of the Obama administration, the vast majority of people with disabilities were living outside the economic mainstream. At the end of the Obama administration, the vast majority of people with disabilities were living outside of the economic mainstream. So we had 8 years of what some might consider a great president, but he didn't use his power to transform the world for people with disabilities. And if you ask the first President Bush, what was the most important thing you did when you were president of the United States? He would tell you signing the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I just think we really do a disservice when we bash Republicans and we see Democrats as nirvana. Senator Harkin's a Democrat, I'm a Democrat, but I recognize that we have work to do on both sides. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering what advice you would give to the university as a whole as far as training lower level managers and mid-level managers on helping these people who are in the workforce with disability, because in my experience it seems like there's definitely some room for improvement in that. So do you have any models or any suggestions for helping to train those managers to help people with disabilities really succeed and flourish?
Yeah, well, first of all, I know I'm a broken record, but I think the ECHO model is one way to do that. You can create communities of practice where managers are learning from each other, just like they're doing in the education context where teachers are learning from each other. The advice that I give managers is to look at, try to be kind of asset-based and not deficit-based, and look at what is this person really good at. You look at all their tasks that they're doing in the job, what are they really good at? And is there a way to have their job evolve where they're spending more time on the things that they're really good at and less time on things that are a struggle for them? Now, in some cases, that's just not going to be possible and the job's not a good fit. But I think a lot of managers are so stuck on the existing job description and they focus on the one thing that you're horrible at and they miss all the stuff that you're good at and then you fail. So I think it's important for managers to try to be creative, but I also think it's important not to just do that with your employees with disabilities. Do it with all your employees. You're going to have a much happier, more productive workforce if people are spending more time on things that they're really good at. And most people are really good at something. Yeah.
Hi. So earlier in the presentation, you had mentioned that the statistics on people with disabilities in the workplace wasn't maybe necessarily accurate because of the way we were asking questions.
I said that they weren't perfect. It's hard for me to know whether they're accurate. They're accurate, but then they have limitations to their accuracy. I probably sound way too much like an academic, but
right.
You understand.
And you said you had worked up 6 questions to maybe fix that possible issue.
I didn't do it. People much smarter than me came up with those 6 questions.
Could you maybe give examples of those questions?
Sure. So they tried to come up with questions that somebody in Wyoming, somebody in New Jersey, and somebody in Alaska would answer the same way and would not have a lot of subjectivity. So they'll ask questions like, can you read the newspaper in the morning, with or without, some kind of visual aid? So people that can't read the newspaper, that becomes a significant enough thing that counts as a disability. Or they'll ask you, if you need help from somebody else to manage your household. I mean, there are questions that are not very subjective, and that depending on how the person answers, there's an indication that there's something significant enough that we're going to count that as a disability. There's nothing wrong with the questions. The challenge is that's not enough questions to capture the whole disability population. So most people with dyslexia will not show up in those 6 questions, but they do have a disability. A lot of those folks are in the labor force, but they don't show up as being disabled people in the labor force because they don't show up as having a disability. So that's what I was getting at when I said there's limitations to how we're doing. And if we asked all the questions we would need to ask to get to a much bigger part of the population, it would be much more than 6 questions, which gets very expensive to administer. So part of it's a money issue.